was February 1944, deep in the mountains of eastern Bosnia. The air was knife cold, the forests silent beneath a shroud of snow. A German convoy wound its way through the narrow gorge. Great trucks, field guns, and the men of the 118th Jäger Division, veterans of the Balkans campaign, hardened by years of fighting guerrillas they called banditen. Their breath clouded the air as engines growled against the icy slope. At first there was only wind, then a single shot. It came from the ridge above, sharp and clean, echoing off the cliffs. The driver of the lead truck slumped forward. Before anyone could react, the world exploded. Mortars screamed from the tree line, bursting among the vehicles. Horses reared, trucks burst into flame. The snow turned black, then red. From every ridge and hollow, figures rose in the smoke. Bearded men in tattered greatcoats, red stars glinting on their caps. They moved like ghosts, firing, shouting, vanishing again. For the Germans it was chaos. Radios failed, orders vanished in the din. The column, stretched for nearly a kilometer, was pinned in a death trap carved by nature and perfected by men who knew every rock and ravine. Within 20 minutes, half the division's vanguard was gone, and as the echoes faded, one name passed through the smoke in fearful whispers: Tito's Wolves. The German 118th Jäger Division had entered Yugoslavia with confidence born of conquest. They were hunters, light infantry trained for rough terrain, schooled in counterinsurgency. They believed no partisan force could match their discipline or their firepower, but the land they marched into was not a battlefield. It was a labyrinth. Bosnia in winter was a kingdom of stone and silence. Peaks rose like teeth from endless forests. Rivers ran black beneath sheets of ice. Villages clung to slopes where even mules faltered. Every path could be a trap, every shepherd a spy. The men of the 118th called it Die Weiße Hölle, the White Hell. Their orders were simple on paper: destroy the partisan 2nd Proletarian Division, cut off their supply routes to Montenegro, and capture or kill Marshal Josip Broz Tito if found. But paper meant little here. The German commander, General Hubert Lanz, had fought in Greece and Italy. He knew mountain war, yet nothing prepared him for the speed and cunning of the Yugoslav Partisans. These were not mere peasants with rifles. They were organized, disciplined, and led by men who understood terrain as intimately as they understood sacrifice. Among them was Veselin Misita, once a teacher, now a legend whispered through the valleys. His men, the so-called Black Company, moved like shadows through the Drina forests. When word reached him that a major German column was advancing toward the town of Rogatica, Misita saw opportunity. He summoned his lieutenants around a frozen campfire, their faces lit by the glow of pine resin. "They think the road is theirs," he said quietly. "Let's remind them it belongs to the mountains." For 3 nights the partisans prepared the ground. They mined the bends, felled trees across the gullies, and dug firing positions along the slopes. Every move was silent. Even the mules were muffled with cloth around their hooves. Women from nearby villages brought food and bandages, whispering prayers as they worked. When dawn came, the forest was still. Mist hung low, thick enough to hide 1,000 men. From the north, the German convoy appeared, trucks, guns, and columns of infantry moving with weary precision. Scouts on skis glided ahead, rifles slung across their backs. In the distance, they saw nothing but snow and rock. Misita gave a single nod. The first mine detonated beneath the lead truck, then all hell followed. For the Germans, the ambush was a nightmare. The partisans struck from 3 sides, their rifles crackling through the fog. Mortar shells rained from invisible ridges. Horses screamed, men shouted in confusion. Officers tried to rally their companies only to be cut down by snipers who knew exactly where to aim. The 3rd Battalion, trapped in the center, tried to break through the southern pass but found the bridge already destroyed. Radio operators screamed for artillery support, but the signal died in static. Lines had been severed. Runners sent into the woods never returned. Within minutes, the precise machinery of the 118th Jäger Division dissolved into chaos. A young corporal named Ernst Böhler crawled beneath a wrecked truck, clutching his Mauser. Smoke and snow stung his eyes. Somewhere above, he heard the partisans singing, a rough, rising chant that cut through the gunfire. Smrt fascismu, sloboda narodu. Death to fascism, freedom to the people. The words chilled him more than the cold. Through the smoke, He saw one of them, bareheaded, face blackened with soot, a red star stitched to his cap, running straight through the barrage with a satchel charge in hand. Buller fired. The figure fell, but another took his place. It felt endless, unstoppable. By noon, the gorge was a furnace. Trucks burned fiercely. Ammunition exploded in bursts that echoed for miles. The smell of cordite and blood mixed with the sharp tang of pine sap. German medics worked frantically under fire, dragging the wounded into shallow ditches. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting ceased. Silence swept over the pass, broken only by the hiss of burning rubber and the moans of the dying. Misita raised his binoculars from the ridge. Below the once proud column was a graveyard of metal. He turned to his men. "Take what you can carry, then vanish." Within minutes they were gone, melting into the forest as quietly as they had come. When German reinforcements finally arrived that evening, there was nothing left to fight. The snow was littered with shell casings, broken helmets, and charred maps. The survivors spoke in fragments, some trembling uncontrollably, others staring into space. Colonel Eberhard, commanding the relief column, wrote in his report, "Our enemy is everywhere and nowhere. They strike like lightning and disappear like smoke. The men whisper that the mountains themselves are against us." Berlin dismissed it as exaggeration. But the division's morale began to crumble. Men refused to patrol alone. Some muttered that every shadow hit a rifle barrel, and the partisans, sensing fear, grew bolder. For Misita's fighters, the victory was brief but symbolic. They had destroyed nearly an entire battalion, captured weapons, and proved that even the most disciplined German unit could bleed. Yet they paid dearly. Scores of comrades dead, others wounded beyond saving. That night, under a cold moon, the survivors buried their fallen in a clearing overlooking the gorge. They marked each grave with a rifle stuck bayonet first into the earth. Misita stood before them and said nothing. He simply removed his cap and looked to the south, where smoke still curled against the stars. "They will come again," one man said quietly. Misita nodded. "Then we will be waiting." The ambush at Rogatica spread through German ranks like wildfire. Rumors claimed entire regiments had been wiped out, that Tito himself had led the attack. Panic crept into the officers' mess halls, where maps were redrawn daily, roads marked in red ink as unsafe. To restore control, General Lanz ordered Operation Russelsprung, the night's move and a daring plan to capture Tito by airborne assault at his headquarters in Dervar. But the mountains remembered the blood of the 118th, and they would not give up their ghosts easily. The German High Command could not afford humiliation. Berlin demanded vengeance for the Rogatica disaster, and vengeance arrived under the codename Operation Russelsprung, Night's Move. The objective was simple on paper: strike at the head, destroy the body, kill or capture Tito himself, but the ground truth was chaos wrapped in snow. Prelude to the storm by May 1944, the Yugoslav resistance had become more than a nuisance. With Allied supplies flowing from Italy and the Red Army advancing from the east, Tito's partisans controlled vast stretches of mountain territory. They ran their own radio networks, hospitals, even schools, an underground nation rising from the rubble. At the center of it all stood the small Bosnian town of Drvar, nestled between steep hills and pine forests. To the Germans it looked remote, insignificant. To the partisans it was sacred ground, the beating heart of the revolution. Tito's headquarters lay inside a cave on a sheer cliff above the Unak River. Every morning, smoke curled from campfires below as columns of young fighters drilled in the clear mountain air. British and Soviet liaison officers moved between tents carrying coded messages. Music drifted from a captured gramophone, an old swing record playing through static. No one imagined that thousands of feet above, in German airfields near Zagreb, an army of paratroopers was already rehearsing their descent into hell. The gathering of eagles, the 118th Jäger Division, still nursing its wounds from Rogatica, was assigned to the southern cordon. They were joined by the 500th SS Parachute Battalion, veterans of Crete and Norway, men hardened to brutality. At their head stood SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Rübke, a precise and ruthless officer with cold eyes and a reputation for success at any cost. Rübke briefed his men on the tarmac. "Our target is the partisan high command. We strike fast, strike hard. Tito must not escape. No prisoners except those of intelligence value. The Führer himself demands results. The paratroopers checked their gear in silence. Machine guns, grenades, flamethrowers. Painted on each glider's nose was the black and white Balkenkreuz. Around them, engines roared to life, filling the dawn with thunder. It was May 25, 1944, Tito's birthday. At Aero 900 hours, the aircraft rose in formation, silver wings glinting over the Dinaric Alps. Below, the mountains waited. The skyfalls on Drvar streets were quiet that morning. Children carried buckets to the river. Women baked bread in clay ovens. In the cave, Tito reviewed reports with his staff, cigarette smoke curling around the flickering lamp. His British aide, Major William Deacon, was reading intercepted German radio chatter when the first drone of engines rolled across the valley. At first, they thought it was an Allied supply drop. Then the sky turned black. Ju-52 transports and gliders swooped out of the clouds, their bellies splitting open. Hundreds of parachutes blossomed against the sunlight like deadly flowers. The air filled with the whistle of descent, the metallic rattle of machine guns, the shrieks of sirens. Villagers screamed, running for cover as bombs ripped through the town square. The wooden church burst into flame. Dust swallowed the streets. From the cliffs, partisan lookouts fired flares, the alarm spreading like wildfire through the hills. In the chaos, Rybka's men landed inside the town cemetery, crashing through tombstones and fences. They regrouped instantly, weapons ready, black uniforms ghostly amid drifting smoke. Their orders were simple: find Tito, the cave inside the cave headquarters. The walls trembled from the impact of shells. Deacon grabbed the field radio. "They're here, Marshal. Paratroopers, hundreds." Tito stood calm amid the dust. He put on his cap, adjusted his holster, and said, "Then it is time we show them who commands this mountain." Outside, partisan guards poured rifle fire into the descending paratroops. Young fighters, some barely 18, ran barefoot through the smoke, carrying ammunition belts around their necks. Machine guns rattled from every window and rooftop. The Germans returned fire with precision bursts, cutting down defenders as they advanced up the narrow street. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed. Rybka's vanguard reached the base of Tito's cliff and began climbing, grenades strapped to belts. Above them, partisans dropped rocks, logs, anything they could find. From inside the cave, Tito watched them through binoculars. "They want me alive," he said. "Let's disappoint them." He ordered his bodyguard, Commissars Danko Stambuk, to prepare a breakout to the east. While machine guns thundered outside, Tito and a handful of aides slipped through a hidden tunnel emerging into the forest. They ran bent low, bullets snapping through the trees. Behind them, the cave roared with explosions as German grenades detonated where the marshal had stood minutes before. The battle in the town Drvar had become a furnace. Every house was a fortress, every street a killing ground. Civilians dragged the wounded through shattered doors while partisan snipers picked off SS troops from attics. The air stank of cordite blood and burning pine. Rybka's radio operator shouted into static, "We have the town. Where are the reinforcements?" None came. The 118th Jäger Division was still miles away, its columns bogged down by blown bridges and mined roads. The partisans, masters of terrain, had anticipated every route of approach. By noon, the paratroopers were isolated, cut off, surrounded by mountains that seemed to close around them like jaws. Tito's escape guided by local shepherds. Tito and his group climbed higher into the forest. Rain began to fall, washing the soot from their faces. They crossed a stream swollen with debris, then paused at a ridge overlooking the burning town. Below, tracer fire streaked upward like veins of light through the storm. He watched for a long moment, face unreadable. Then he turned to Deacon. "Tell London," he said, "the Germans have failed. But the people pay the price." They moved again, vanishing into the mist. By nightfall, they reached Kupres Plateau, where Soviet-supplied Yak fighters roared overhead, hunting the German retreat. Tito was alive, and the myth grew tenfold. The collapse of the assault back in Drvar. Rybka's men fought to the last bullet. By evening, their ammunition was nearly gone. Partisan reinforcements poured in from the surrounding hills, shouting through the rain, their bayonets glinting. Wounded paratroopers huddled in doorways. The cemetery turned into a swamp of blood and mud. At dusk, Rybka himself was shot through the leg and captured. When partisans dragged him into the open, he refused to speak. The next morning, only a few dozen of the SS paratroopers were still alive. The operation had failed utterly. Tito was free, and the 118th Jäger Division, tasked with sealing the trap, had arrived too late to matter. General Lance's final report would read, "Objective unfulfilled. Enemy command structure remains intact. Losses heavy. Morale affected." But for the men on the ground, those words were ashes. They had learned the same truth the Rogatica ambush had whispered. The mountains of Yugoslavia belonged to the partisans. The aftermath in the days that followed, German columns withdrew under constant harassment. Every bend brought sniper fire. Every ravine hid dynamite. The forests were alive with songs, the partisans singing victory hymns as they moved through the fog. When Allied radio broadcast the news that Tito had survived, the message carried across the world. The Germans could not crush Yugoslavia. Churchill called it one of the most daring and gallant resistance efforts in Europe. For the 118th Jäger Division, the phrase Drvar became a curse. Soldiers whispered it around campfires, voices low. They knew now that every patrol could become their last. Some nights they heard drums echoing through the valleys, partisan signals rolling like thunder. "It means they are watching," one sergeant said. They always are. In those same nights, deep in a hidden valley, Tito wrote in his notebook by candlelight, "They tried to take me from the heart of my people, but they do not understand. My people are the mountain." He closed the book, and somewhere beyond the ridges, wolves howled into the storm. The rain did not stop for 7 days. It fell in gray sheets across the mountains, washing the smoke of Drvar into the valleys. Rivers swelled, bridges collapsed, and the men of the 118th Jäger Division slogged through knee-deep mud that clung like cement. Their faces were hollow, uniforms soaked, boots rotting from endless marches. They were the hunters once. Now they were the hunted. General Hubert Lanz, his pride still smarting from the failed Drvar assault, ordered a full-scale sweep through western Bosnia. Every gorge, every forest, every shepherd's hut was to be searched and burned. He wanted revenge, not for strategy, but for honor. No mercy, he told his officers. The mountains will learn discipline, but the mountains were deaf to arrogance. And the men who lived among them, the partisans, could hear everything. They struck first. On the night of June the 2nd, the 118th 2nd Battalion camped near the village of Ostrel, believing themselves safe. Rain muffled the forest, fires burned low, sentries hunched beneath tarps. Then came the whistle, high, sharp, almost playful, followed by an explosion that split the night open. Mortars rained from the ridgeline. Machine guns spat from every direction. The German camp disintegrated in seconds. Men stumbled half-dressed from tents, rifles slipping from their hands. The air was alive with shouting in 2 languages, German and Serbo-Croatian, blending into a single chaos of screams. By the time the first flares rose, the partisans were already among them. Dark shapes leaping through firelight, knives flashing, shouts of "Napred!
Za Drvar!
Forward!" For Drvar. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When dawn came, the forest floor steamed with mist and blood. From that night onward, the 118th lived in a state of siege. Every valley they entered seemed to close behind them. Mines on the roads, ambushes in the trees. Villages that looked empty by day came alive by night. A German captain, Friedrich Becker, wrote in his diary, "The silence itself is hostile. Even the wind carries footsteps. We shoot at shadows." His company was reduced from 120 men to 43 within 3 weeks. For the partisans, the war was now deeply personal. Among their ranks were survivors of burned towns, mothers whose children had been taken by the SS, sons who had seen fathers hanged from village trees. They fought not for orders, but for vengeance. In the hills above Glamic, a group of partisan scouts under Mira Savic, a 23-year-old woman who had once been a nurse, prepared another trap. Her unit, the Wolf Company, specialized in sabotage and misdirection. They dressed in captured German coats, moved by night, and spoke fluent German to confuse sentries. Her favorite trick was the false retreat. She would attack a convoy, vanish, then strike again from the opposite slope just as the enemy began tending the wounded. Her men called it the Dance of the Wolves. One moonless night, Mira and her scouts watched from a ridge as a column of Jägers approached the narrow valley below. Their lanterns swayed like fireflies, she whispered to her radio man. "Wait until the third truck, then light the match." When the explosion came, it tore through the road like thunder. The convoy buckled. The survivors dove for cover and directly into crossfire. The forest lit up in strobing muzzle flashes, tracer rounds slicing the dark. Mira fired 3 quick bursts, then shouted, "Fall back!" By the time the Germans regrouped, the attackers were gone, leaving behind only silence and the smell of pine smoke. Panic spread through the division's ranks. The men refused to march at night, refused to eat local food, convinced it was poisoned. Officers carried sidearms even while sleeping. In some units, discipline collapsed completely. Soldiers fired into the forest at random, shooting shadows. General Lanz sent harsh reprimands, but letters from the front told the truth. One officer wrote, "We have lost control. The enemy does not fight battles. He bleeds us one man at a time." By mid-July, the 118th numbers had fallen below half strength. The survivors were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and superstitious. Some claimed to hear drums echoing in the fog, slow, rhythmic, as if the earth itself was mocking them. Others swore they saw ghostly figures watching from the cliffs. In truth, it was the partisans playing mind games. They lit small fires at night in distant valleys, moved them in patterns, creating illusions of entire armies. They broadcast German commands through captured loudspeakers to lure patrols into traps. One recorded voice repeated endlessly, "Kameraden, kommt hierher. Wir sind sicher. Comrades, come this way. We are safe." Those who followed the voice never returned. On July 18th, the division's supply convoy attempted to cross the Unak River under heavy rain. The bridge, repaired the week before, gave way halfway across. Trucks plunged into the torrent. Within minutes, the partisans opened fire from both banks. Explosions illuminated the night like lightning. A survivor recalled, "We did not see men, only the flashes of rifles. The forest itself was shooting at us." By morning, the river carried away dozens of bodies and crates of ammunition. The survivors staggered downstream, weapons gone, morale shattered. Even among the officers, fear began to take root. Captain Becker was found dead in his tent, a pistol beside him, a note reading, "They are everywhere. I hear them when I close my eyes." General Lanz, furious but powerless, ordered a withdrawal toward Knin. "We are soldiers," he told his adjutant, "not ghosts, and this land belongs to ghosts." The retreat began under heavy rain. The roads had turned to rivers of mud, and every kilometer cost blood. For the partisans, the retreat was the moment they had waited for. Tito's forces, now reinforced with Allied supplies and Soviet weapons, moved in from all directions, mortar teams, cavalry units, and local brigades that seemed to appear out of thin air. The once invincible 118th was now a wounded animal limping through a forest full of predators. Mira Savic's wolf. Company shadowed the column day and night, striking from ridges, burning supply trucks, cutting telephone lines. Her men learned to recognize individual German voices on the radios, mocking them between bursts of static. "How's the white hell, Jägers?" they'd say. "Still hunting ghosts?" The replies were curses and silence. By August, the Germans reached Knin, battered and exhausted. Out of the division's 12,000 men, fewer than 6,500 remained combat effective. They had lost half their equipment and nearly all their confidence. Their morale was gone, their uniforms in rags. Lanz sent a final communique to Army Group F in Belgrade. "The enemy does not exist as an army, but as the land itself. Every tree hides a rifle, every night brings fire. We have learned that we cannot kill the wind." The High Command offered no reply. That autumn, the 118th Jäger Division was redeployed to Dalmatia to guard coastal positions, far from the forest that had destroyed its spirit. But the men carried the mountains with them in their dreams, in their shaking hands. Some would wake screaming, hearing again the whistle before the explosions. As for Mira Savic and her wolf company, their legend spread across Yugoslavia. To the people, they were heroes. To the Germans, they were phantoms. In her final report of that campaign, Mira wrote only one sentence: "The hunter who forgets he can be hunted is already dead." Years later, when peace returned and Yugoslavia was whole again, old villagers would tell stories to children about the winter of the wolves, how the mountain itself rose to avenge its people. They said that on cold nights, if you listen from the ridges near Drvar, you can still hear the echo of gunfire carried by the wind. And sometimes, just sometimes, a woman's voice whispering through the trees, "Forward for Drvar." The summer of 1944 bled into autumn, and the mountains changed color. Green turning to iron gray, streams thickening with mud, the air heavy with the smell of decay. For the 118th Jäger Division, retreat offered no salvation. The ghosts that had stalked them through Bosnia followed them west, down into the valleys of Dalmatia, where stone villages clung to cliffs like scars. There, among olive groves and bombed-out farmhouses, the Germans dug in to hold the coast, their last line before the Adriatic. The sea wind carried the scent of salt and diesel, mingling with the stench of unwashed men and fear. General Hubert Lance walked the trenches outside Knin, his boots crunching over broken bricks. He told his staff that the worst was over, but his eyes said otherwise. "The partisans have no heavy artillery," he muttered. "They will not follow us here." He was wrong. Far to the north, Tito's forces were no longer the ragged bands that had ambushed convoys in the snow. They were now a true army, over 200,000 strong, equipped with British Bren guns, American jeeps, Soviet mortars, and the grim determination of people who had nothing left to lose. Columns of men marched under Red Star flags across the ridges, guided by villagers who had once hidden in cellars while the Germans burned their homes. Alongside them came women with rifles slung across their shoulders, their hair bound in scarves against the wind. They sang as they walked, their voices rising like thunder through the valleys. "Death to fascism, freedom to the people." The words echoed from hill to hill, until even the Germans on the coast could hear them in the night wind. Inside the stone fortress above Knin, the 118th's officers pored over maps that had long since lost meaning. Supply lines were cut, radio contact with Belgrade sporadic. The Allies had invaded southern France and Italy, and now the Adriatic shimmered with enemy ships. From the cliffs, sentries could see the glow of distant naval gunfire at night, flashes of light across the horizon like the heartbeat of a dying empire. Morale collapsed. Desertions began quietly, then in waves. Whole squads slipped into the darkness, abandoning weapons to melt into the countryside. Some surrendered to the partisans, others vanished into mountain villages, hoping to be mistaken for locals. Those who stayed felt the land closing in again. The first attack came before dawn on October 1st, 1944. Artillery thundered from the hills east of Knin, not German guns, but captured ones turned against their former masters. Shells rained down on the German positions for hours. The entire valley glowed red as tracer rounds arced across the dark. The partisans came in waves, their assault coordinated like a professional army. This was no longer the dance of ambushes. It was open war. General Lance's headquarters shook under bombardment. When the shelling paused, his field phone rang. A voice shouted through static, "They're in the town." "They've broken through the southern gate." Lance turned to his adjutant, eyes hollow. "Then we fight here," he said. To the last round. Through the narrow streets of Knin, battle raged like wildfire. The partisans advanced building to building, grenades in hand, rifles slung over shoulders, faces streaked with soot. German machine guns cut them down, but more took their place. One platoon of the 118th, boys from Bavaria, held the church square until their ammunition ran dry. When the last bullet was spent, their sergeant shouted, "Bayonets!" and led them forward into the smoke. They died where they stood, surrounded by broken statues and shattered bells. Among the attacking units was Mira Savic's Wolf Company. She led her fighters through the alleys, shouting orders over the thunder of artillery. At one corner, a mortar shell tore a hole through a stone wall, throwing her to the ground. She stood, blood running down her face, and kept moving. By noon, the partisans had surrounded the German command post. Inside, General Lance knew it was over. The walls trembled with every impact. His officers argued, some demanding surrender, others shouting for a breakout. The radio crackled with reports of mass defections and encircled battalions. He looked at the framed photograph of his division taken in 1942. Proud faces, crisp uniforms, sunlight over the Alps, and realized that not one of those men remained unbroken. He turned to his adjutant. "Destroy the codes," he said. "Burn everything." Then he took his pistol and walked outside. The final stand of the 118th Jäger Division lasted less than 2 hours. By dusk, the town of Knin was in flames. Partisans flooded through the ruins, shouting victory slogans as German soldiers threw down their weapons. The survivors, barely 2,000 men, were rounded up in the central square under the cold gaze of their captors. A partisan commander climbed onto the hood of a wrecked truck and shouted, "The hunters are hunted no more. The mountains have been avenged." The captured Germans stared at the ground. Some wept. Others stared blankly, as if still hearing the drums of the forest they had fled. Mira Savage stood at the edge of the square, watching the prisoners. Among them were men she recognized from Drvar, the same division that had burned her village, that had killed her brother. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt nothing but exhaustion. One of her soldiers approached. "What now, Commander?" She looked toward the horizon where the sea shimmered beneath the setting sun. "Now," she said quietly, "now we bury the dead." That night, as the fires died down, the survivors of both sides lay scattered across the valley. The partisans buried their comrades with song, rifles raised in salute. The Germans dug graves for their own under watchful eyes. Somewhere in the distance, the sea whispered against the cliffs, eternal and indifferent. In his final report to headquarters before being captured, Lanz wrote, "The war in the Balkans is not a campaign. It is a punishment. The land itself has condemned us." He was taken prisoner the next morning. When the sun rose over Kinin, the Red Star flag fluttered from the church tower. The war in Yugoslavia was turning, and the world was watching. The fall of the 118th Jäger Division became a symbol, proof that the resistance could do what no army in Europe had yet done: destroy a full German division in open battle. From the Adriatic to the Drina, the partisans marched as heroes. Allied planes dropped supplies in celebration. Moscow broadcast news of Tito's victory across Europe. The hunted were now the hunters, and the mountains stood silent, smoke curling above them like incense over a grave. Weeks later, Mira Savage visited the battlefield one last time. The air smelled of salt and rust, the fields littered with helmets and broken rifles. She walked among the wreckage, her boots crunching over spent casings. She stopped where the old road curved toward the sea and saw a rusted sign still half standing. 118th Jäger Division, Headquarters. She raised her rifle and fired once into the air. The sound echoed through the valley, then faded into the wind. "For Drvar," she whispered, and she turned away. The guns went quiet before the world realized the war was ending. In the highlands of Bosnia, silence fell like snow, slow, soft, and heavy. Smoke drifted from the valleys for days, the last breath of a land that had burned for half a decade. The cries, the marching boots, the thunder of mortars, and all vanished, leaving only wind whispering through broken forests. The men and women who had lived in that storm stood still, unable to believe it was gone. In Drvar, the town that had once been reduced to ashes, the air smelled again of pine and wet stone. Villagers returned from caves and ravines where they had hidden since the German occupation began. They walked through the ruins in silence, tracing the outlines of their former homes with their hands. Among them was Mira Savage. Her hair had turned gray at the edges, though she was not yet 30. She carried no weapon now, only a small notebook wrapped in cloth. The Wolf Company had been dissolved, its surviving members absorbed into the new Yugoslav People's Army. Yet she could still hear their voices in the wind, the laughter before the battles, the songs in the night. She stopped by the edge of the old gorge where, a year before, she had ambushed the 118th Jäger Division's convoy. Grass grew now between the wrecks of burned trucks. Rusted helmets lay half buried in moss. The river murmured below like an old secret. For a long time she stood there, listening. "It's over," she said quietly, though no one was there to answer. Far away on the Adriatic coast, the remnants of the 118th Jäger Division were herded into prison camps. Some were shipped to Italy, others to Belgrade for trial. Their uniforms were gone, their insignia torn away. They were men without names, soldiers of a dead cause. General Hubert Lanz, once proud commander of mountain troops, now sat in a wooden chair behind barbed wire. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he wrote in a small notebook smuggled from the guards. "We thought we were fighting partisans," he wrote, "but we fought the land itself. The mountains, the rivers, the faces of peasants who looked at us not with fear but with patience. We had every weapon except purpose." He closed the book and stared toward the sea. In the evenings, he said, he could still hear the drums. In Belgrade, Tito stood on a balcony overlooking a crowd of tens of thousands. Flags waved beneath him, red, blue, white, the colors of a nation reborn from its own fire. He wore his familiar gray uniform, simple and clean, without medals. Around him stood Allied envoys and Soviet officers, their eyes measuring the man who had defied both Hitler and the odds. "We are free," he said into the wind. "Not because someone gave us freedom, but because we took it with our own hands." The crowd roared. Church bells rang across the city, the sound carrying through streets still scarred by bullet holes. In the crowd below, a woman held a photograph of her husband who had died at Drvar. An old man raised the torn sleeve of a uniform once worn in the hills. Children climbed onto rubble to wave flags higher than their bodies. The war had devoured everything, but it had not devoured them. For the survivors of the 118th Jäger Division, news of the celebration reached them in fragments, whispered through the camp fences, printed on leaflets dropped by Allied aircraft. Some cursed, others simply stared at the sky. They were young men now aged into ghosts, their memories trapped between guilt and disbelief. One former corporal, Ernst Bühler, who had once hidden under a burning truck at Rogatica, wrote home from captivity. "The enemy I feared now builds homes where we left ashes. I do not know which of us was the barbarian." His letter was never answered. His village in Bavaria no longer existed, bombed by Allied raids in April 1945. As winter approached, the first snow fell over Bosnia again. In the hills above Drvar, Mira Savic lit a small fire beside a makeshift cross marking the graves of her fallen comrades. She read aloud from her notebook the names of those who had not lived to see peace. With each name she tore a page from the book and placed it in the flames, watching it curl into ash that rose toward the stars. The forest around her was quiet, save for the crackle of fire. Then faintly from somewhere far below came singing, the voices of villagers rebuilding, hammering wood, raising new roofs against the wind. For the first time in years, Mira smiled. The mountains, once soaked in blood, were turning green again. Spring followed like forgiveness. Fields bloomed where trenches had been. Children played among rusting helmets, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet. Life, stubborn and patient, returned. But for those who had fought, German, Yugoslav, Allied alike, the echoes never faded. They lived on in the way men hesitated before entering forests, in the silence that fell when thunder rolled across the hills. The war had ended, but the mountains remembered. In 1947, Allied photographers documented the old German positions around Knin and Drvar. The images showed little more than stones and wild grass, the remains of bunkers half swallowed by earth. Yet when developed, one photo revealed something strange. Faint outlines of figures in the distance, blurred by fog, almost human, almost smoke. One archivist later wrote in the margin, "Maybe the mountains keep their own memorials." That same year, a memorial was built at the site of Tito's cave. Tourists and veterans climbed the steps to look upon the narrow entrance where, 3 years earlier, he had escaped the paratroopers' assault. Inside, the wall still bore scorch marks from grenades. On a small plaque engraved in simple Cyrillic letters were words attributed to Tito himself. "They came for me, but they met my people. Visitors left flowers. Children touched the stone as if to feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath it. And in the evenings, when the sun sank behind the Dinaric Alps, the valley filled with golden light, the same light that had once glinted off parachutes, now soft and forgiving." In Germany, the name Drvar vanished from textbooks. The 118th Jäger Division was quietly dissolved, its remnants absorbed into post-war obscurity. But among veterans it remained a whisper, a name spoken rarely, like a wound that never healed. In the cafes of Munich and Stuttgart, men with gray hair and hollow eyes would sometimes fall silent when the Balkans were mentioned. One might murmur, "Those mountains," and another would nod, lost in memory. They knew that somewhere in the mists of Bosnia, a part of them still wandered, forever hunted. As decades passed, the forests reclaimed everything. Trees grew through tank hulls. Wildflowers covered the graves. The rust of war turned to soil, and the wind that once carried screams now carried only birdsong. Yet for those who visit Drvar today, if they walk alone at dusk and the light begins to fade, they say the air grows colder, and the forest begins to whisper. Some swear they can hear the faint rhythm of boots crunching on snow, the click of a rifle bolt, the echo of a voice shouting, "Smrt fascismu!" Then once silence, only the mountains remain, patient and eternal. That silence is not empty. It is the sound of the dead finally sleeping, of the living rebuilding, of a land that has earned its peace through unthinkable pain. And if you listen closely enough, carried on the evening wind, you may still hear them, the hunters and the hunted, bound together forever in the story of those mountains. The echo fades. The screen darkens. The war is over.